In June of 1892, in the small agricultural town of Shibayama in Chiba Prefecture, a boy was born into a family of modest means and considerable ambition. His father ran a small sake brewery. The family was respectable, not wealthy.
The boy was the third son of 7 children. His childhood photographs show a thin-faced child with round glasses and an expression that the people who later tried to describe him, his former classmates, his surviving colleagues, the Americans who debriefed him after the war, consistently struggled to characterize.
Not cruel, not unusual, simply attentive, watchful. His name was Shirō Ishii. He was bright, exceptionally so. He passed the entrance examinations for Kyoto Imperial University, which in the early 20th century was among the most demanding academic institutions in all of Asia.
He enrolled in the medical faculty in 1916. He graduated in 1921. He completed his doctorate in 1927, specializing in bacteriology and immunology. His thesis on blood filtration received academic recognition. By any measure available to those who knew him before 1932, Shirō Ishii was a physician, a scientist, a man who had dedicated a decade of his life to understanding how the human body fought disease. He was 39 years old when construction began on the installation in Pingfeng, Manchuria. He was 45 years old when the first systematic mass experiments on live human subjects were documented in detail by his own staff. He was 53 years old when Japan surrendered and the installation was destroyed. But none of that was visible in Shibayama in 1892.
None of it was written in the face of the thin-faced boy with round glasses who would go on to study medicine and dedicate his professional life to the human body, not to healing it, but to learning with methodical precision exactly how much the human body could endure before it ceased to function.
That distance between the boy in Shibayama and the commander of Unit 731 is what this video is about. Not the atrocity itself, though the atrocity is documented, and it was real, and it demands to be named, but the distance, the transformation.
The specific set of institutional conditions that turned a licensed physician into the commander of the most extensive human experimentation program in recorded history. A program so extreme that when American investigators first received detailed reports about it in 1945, their initial classified assessment stated, with bureaucratic precision, that the scope of the activities described exceeded anything conducted by Nazi Germany.
That sentence was written by American military intelligence officers in 1945. It is a documented historical fact. We will return to what the Americans did with that assessment, because what they did is the second half of this story, and in many ways the more disturbing half.
But let us begin where the transformation began, in the Japanese Imperial Army of the early 1920s. Shirō Ishii joined the Army Medical Corps in 1921, immediately after completing his medical degree. This was not an unusual choice for a young physician of his generation and ambition.
The Imperial Japanese Army offered status, resources, and a clear institutional ladder.
For a bacteriologist, it offered something more specific: access to the emerging field of biological warfare research, which the major military powers were quietly beginning to explore in the years following the 1925 Geneva Protocol, the international agreement that had just prohibited the use of chemical and biological weapons in war. Here is the critical institutional mechanism. The 1925 Geneva Protocol did not prohibit the development of biological weapons.
It prohibited their use in warfare. This distinction between development and deployment created a legal and institutional space that military planners across multiple nations began to map with great interest. If a nation could develop biological weapons that were powerful enough, the prohibition on use became almost academic. The research itself had military value, regardless of whether the weapons were ever deployed. Ishii understood this distinction with exceptional clarity. In 1927, he traveled to Europe and the United States on a 2-year research tour, sponsored by the Imperial Japanese Army, during which he visited military installations, medical research facilities, and universities across 14 countries. He was officially studying infectious disease control. He was actually cataloging every nation's approach to biological warfare research.
When he returned to Japan in 1929, he submitted a classified report to the Army General Staff arguing that Japan was falling critically behind, that biological weapons represented the next decisive factor in modern warfare. The technical knowledge necessary to develop effective biological weapons required a specific form of research that could not be conducted in a conventional laboratory. It required, Ishii argued, access to living human subjects. Let me be precise about what he was proposing. He was not arguing for improved animal testing. He was not discussing computer modeling or theoretical calculations. He was proposing a systematic research program in which living human beings would be infected with diseases, exposed to chemical agents, subjected to physiological stress, and studied while alive, with the explicit goal of generating data on human biological responses that could not be obtained any other way. The Japanese Army General Staff approved the proposal. This is the gateway, not a moment of sudden radicalization, not a secret meeting in a dark room where someone whispered forbidden ideas to a vulnerable man. The gateway was institutional. It was bureaucratic. It was approved with official signatures by military officers in formal uniforms who weighed the strategic value of the research against the moral cost of conducting it and made a documented decision. The research was worth it. Ishii received funding. He received personnel. He received an official designation. And in 1932, construction began on the first installation, initially called Jongma Fortress, in the Japanese-occupied territory of Manchuria. The choice of location was deliberate. Manchuria was under Japanese military control, but was technically a puppet state, the Empire of Manchukuo. Japanese law, such as it was, did not apply there with the same administrative clarity as in Japan proper. International observers had limited access. The local population was not Japanese, which, in the ideology of Imperial Japan, carried specific implications for how the military establishment classified the moral status of research conducted on them. The first subjects brought to Zongma Fortress were Chinese prisoners classified by the military administration as criminals, suspected resistance members, or simply civilians caught in sweeps of surrounding areas. The records that survived, examined by historians including Sheldon Harris and Hal Gold in their post-war research, indicate that the first systematic experiments were conducted in 1932 and 1933. But Zongma Fortress was small, temporary, a proof of concept. What Ishii was building toward was something much larger. In 1936, Emperor Hirohito signed the imperial ordinance that officially designated the new installation at Pangfang, approximately 24 kilometers south of Harbin, as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. In internal documents and among its own personnel, it was called Unit 731. The cover designation is worth examining for a moment because it tells you something about the institutional psychology at work. Epidemic prevention, water purification. These were not chosen at random. They were chosen because they represented the opposite of what the installation actually did. They invoked the protective, healing function of medicine, the legitimate face of the white coat and the stethoscope. The bureaucratic camouflage was not merely strategic. It reflected an institutional need to frame the work in the language of legitimate science, even while conducting something that had no legitimate scientific precedent. The physical installation at Pingfang covered approximately 6 square kilometers. It included more than 150 buildings. It had its own railway siding. It had a runway for aircraft. It had a prison block designed to hold between 400 and 600 subjects at any given time. It had laboratories, autopsy facilities, specialized experimental chambers for testing biological agents in controlled conditions, and a dedicated incineration facility. The incineration facility was for disposing of the bodies. The subjects, referred to internally as marutas, a Japanese word meaning logs, were predominantly Chinese, but also included Soviet prisoners, Korean conscripts, Mongolians, and, according to some documented post-war accounts, a small number of Allied prisoners of war. The total number of people who passed through Unit 731 and its associated units across Manchuria between 1936 and 1945 is estimated by historian Sheldon Harris at approximately 3,000. The Chinese government's official estimate is higher, approximately 10,000. The discrepancy reflects the near-total destruction of records ordered by Ishii on August 9, 1945, the day the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. But let me be precise about what the innovation was, because Ishii was not simply conducting experiments. He was systematically engineering a research program designed to generate practical military data with a speed and efficiency that no other research program in history had achieved. The distinction between what Unit 731 produced and what was produced by other wartime research programs, including German programs under the Nazis, is not simply a matter of scale. It is a matter of design philosophy. Nazi human experimentation, documented at Nuremberg, was conducted by multiple physicians across multiple institutions with varying goals, standards, and methodologies. Much of it was driven by ideological obsessions as much as by military utility. Some of the experiments served no coherent scientific purpose at all. Historians examining the Nazi medical records after the war found that much of the data generated was scientifically worthless, produced by researchers with poor methodology and inadequate controls, conducted in conditions that made the results unreproducible. Ishii was a trained bacteriologist with a doctorate and more than a decade of legitimate research experience. He designed Unit 731's research program with the systematic logic of a scientific institution. Experiment protocols were documented, control groups were used where possible, results were recorded in standardized formats. The data generated was, by the assessment of American biological warfare specialists who examined it after the war, scientifically valid. This is one of the most disturbing sentences in the entire history of Unit 731, and it requires a moment to process. The data was valid. It was valid because it had been generated by infecting living, conscious human beings with plague, cholera, typhoid, anthrax, and at least 17 other pathogens under controlled conditions. It was valid because those human beings had been subjected to pressure experiments to determine the point at which organs failed. It was valid because frostbite experiments had been conducted on hundreds of subjects to generate data on tissue damage and rewarming that could not be produced in any other way. It was valid because vivisection, surgical procedures conducted on living subjects without anesthesia, had produced anatomical data that was recorded in detailed scientific reports. The validity of the data was inseparable from the crime that had produced it. And Shirō Ishii knew this. He had designed the system to make it so. Here is where the dissonance becomes unavoidable. In the documented accounts of Unit 731 that have emerged through post-war research, through the testimonies of former members collected by Japanese journalist Seiichi Morimura, through the Chinese survivor accounts compiled by researchers at Harbin's Unit 731 Museum, through the declassified American intelligence files, there is a recurring detail about Ishii's behavior within the installation that is impossible to reconcile with the white coat and the medical degree. He enjoyed it. Former unit members described him as enthusiastic in experimental settings, energetic, engaged. He would visit the experimental chambers. He would review results personally. He developed what his subordinates described as a personal investment in specific research lines, particularly the plague weapons program, which he considered his most significant contribution to Japanese military capability. He hosted banquets for visiting military officials, at which he served food and sake and discussed the progress of the research in the tone of a proud department head briefing senior management on a successful quarter. There are documented accounts of him personally explaining experimental results to visitors, using photographs and preserved specimens, with what multiple witnesses described as evident pride. He had a special sake cup made. According to testimony collected after the war by American investigators, it was fashioned from a human skull. The detail is in the record. It is not invented for effect. It was documented in post-war testimony by former unit members and included in classified American intelligence assessments. The medical degree, the research protocols, the systematic data collection, and the skull cup. These existed simultaneously in the same man. That is the dissonance. And it is documented. But the victims were not abstractions. They were not Maruthas. They were specific human beings, and some of them survived. And what they described cannot be reduced to data points.
Her name is documented in the records as Yang Yufen. She was a Chinese woman from a village near Harbin. She was approximately 22 years old when she was brought to the Pingfong installation in 1942 on suspicion of having contacts with Chinese resistance groups. The specific charge was never formally documented because no formal legal process was applied to her case or to the cases of most subjects brought to Unit 731. She was held in the prison block for what she later estimated as 4 months before the experiments began. In the testimony she gave to Chinese investigators in 1954, one of the few detailed survivor accounts from this period, she described the structure of the prison block with a specificity that makes the space tangible.
Cells approximately 2 meters by 3 meters. Concrete floors. A small window covered with wire mesh, through which she could sometimes hear sounds from the experimental sections of the facility.
The guards never addressed the prisoners by name. They used numbers. When she was selected for the first experiment, she was not told what was going to happen. She was told only to remove her clothing and lie on a metal table.
She survived the first experiment and the second. The third experiment, she could not identify what agent was being tested, left her with a permanent tremor in her left hand. That was documented by the Chinese investigators who interviewed her more than a decade later.
She survived the Pingfong installation because of a decision that she described as incomprehensible at the time. In late 1943, for reasons never explained to her, she and approximately 30 other subjects were removed from the experimental rotation and transferred to a work detail performing cleaning and maintenance tasks in the non-experimental sections of the facility.
The best historical explanation researchers have been able to offer is that the experimental program had generated specific data it needed from these particular subjects, and they were temporarily more useful alive as a labor resource.
She was 23 years old. She had entered a facility that classified human beings as timber. She had survived because briefly she had been reclassified as something marginally more useful than experimental material. When she described Ishii in her testimony, she had seen him once walking through a section of the facility. She used a word that the Chinese investigators asked her to clarify. She said he looked content. She said this as if it were the most confusing thing she had witnessed in all of her time at Pingfong. The experiments, the screaming from other cells, the guards with their numbers. All of that she had processed at some level as systematic, as the functioning of a machine that operated according to rules she could not fully understand, but that had an internal logic. But a man who looked content, that she had not been able to explain to herself in the 12 years between her liberation and the testimony. By the summer of 1945, Unit 731 had been operational for more than 9 years. The data it had generated filled thousands of documents. The plague weapons program had advanced to the point where field deployment had been tested with documented results against Chinese civilian populations in multiple cities. The cholera, typhoid, and anthrax programs were similarly advanced.
Ishii had, by the military's own assessment, fulfilled the institutional mandate given to him in 1929. And then, on August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima.
On August 9th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, and Soviet forces began advancing into Manchuria. On August 9th, the same day as the Soviet declaration of war, Shirō Ishii ordered the destruction of Unit 731. The subjects still alive in the experimental facilities were killed. The buildings were demolished with explosives and burned. The records were destroyed in mass incineration. The staff were dispersed. Ishii reportedly addressed the departing personnel and told them that what they had done at Pingfong was secret, would remain secret, and that they should take the secret to their graves. He was 53 years old. He went home to Japan. And this is where the story becomes something other than a story about one man. Because what happened next was not a reckoning. It was a transaction.
American occupation forces arrived in Japan in September 1945 with a specific mandate to investigate Japanese biological warfare activities. The initial reports they received were alarming.
Documents that had survived the destruction at Pingfong, combined with interrogations of former unit members, painted a picture of a research program of extraordinary scale and sophistication.
The assessment prepared by Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders, one of the American officers tasked with the initial investigation, noted explicitly that the biological warfare data generated by Unit 731 was of significant military value, and that nothing comparable existed in American or Allied research programs.
General Douglas MacArthur, commanding the Allied occupation of Japan, forwarded the assessment to Washington. Washington responded with a classified instruction that has been documented through Freedom of Information Act requests pursued by researchers including Sheldon Harris in his 1994 book, Factories of Death. The data was to obtain. Immunity was to be offered in exchange.
Shirō Ishii met with American biological warfare investigators in May 1946. He was not under arrest. He was not facing charges. According to the documented accounts of those meetings, he arrived in a relaxed state.
He had calculated correctly that the Americans wanted the data more than they wanted him. He negotiated. The terms were simple: comprehensive research reports on all Unit 731 programs, full cooperation with American investigators, and in return, immunity from prosecution for himself and all members of Unit 731. The agreement was reached.
In 1949, at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, the Pacific equivalent of Nuremberg, the prosecution raised the subject of Unit 731. MacArthur Headquarters intervened. The evidence was classified. The subjects were not heard. The commanders were not indicted.
The immunity agreement held. In his post-war interviews with American investigators, documents that remained classified until the 1990s, Ishii described the research programs at Unit 731 in the same systematic, analytical tone that former unit members had described him using at the installation itself. He discussed experimental outcomes. He compared methodologies. He offered technical assessments of which research lines had been most productive. He expressed no remorse. This is documented, not implied, not inferred from absence of evidence.
Documented in the American interview transcripts, the investigators noted explicitly that the subject showed no indication of moral distress when discussing the experimental subjects, no acknowledgement of the human cost of the research, and no expressed regret for any aspect of the program.
He was given the opportunity multiple times across multiple interview sessions to comment on the human consequences of the research. The transcripts record his responses as technical. He discussed the research. He did not discuss the subjects.
When pressed on one occasion, the exchange is in the record, he described the experimental subjects as necessary resources for achieving research goals that served military purposes, framing this as the kind of institutional resource allocation decision that any senior administrator makes when managing a large research program.
The investigator's follow-up question is also in the record. He asked Ishii if he considered the subjects to have been human beings. Ishii's response, as transcribed, was, "They were of a different category." He was 54 years old when he said this.
He had been practicing medicine for 30 years. He had a doctorate in bacteriology. He had commanded an installation that had processed between 3,000 and 10,000 human beings as experimental material over 9 years, and he described them as a different category.
In the trial proceedings that were allowed to occur, covering other Japanese war crimes but systematically excluding Unit 731, prosecutors and defense attorneys constructed competing frameworks of moral and legal accountability.
The defense arguments for other accused Japanese officers were, in many cases, structural. They had been operating within institutional systems that required obedience, that normalized extreme actions, and that rewarded execution of orders over moral independent judgment. These arguments had a specific logic. Soldiers in hierarchical military systems operate under genuine institutional pressure. The Japanese Imperial Army's culture of absolute obedience to command authority was documented and real.
The institutional gateway, the way the system had reshaped moral frameworks across the military establishment, was genuine. But Ishii had not been following orders about Unit 731.
He had written the proposal. He had built the institutional framework. He had designed the research programs. He had argued to his superiors that human experimentation was necessary, and then, once given authorization, had substantially exceeded its scope at every stage.
The institutional gateway had not simply transformed him,
He had helped build the gateway. Here is what the self-justification ultimately relies on and why it fails under examination.
The different category argument, the claim that the experimental subjects were not fully human in the morally relevant sense, is the foundational rationalization of every systematic atrocity in the historical record. It is the cognitive mechanism that allows physicians to violate their oaths, soldiers to commit massacres, and administrators to process death as paperwork. It converts the moral question, what am I doing to another person, into a categorical question, what kind of thing am I doing this to?
Once the category is sufficiently degraded, the moral constraint disappears. The physician becomes an experimenter. The prisoner becomes a maruta, the log.
Ishii understood this mechanism and deployed it deliberately. The internal language of Unit 731, the Maruta designation, the numbered identification system, the administrative classification of subjects as research resources, was not accidental bureaucratic shorthand.
It was designed. It was designed to do exactly what it did, to maintain across hundreds of research staff and supporting personnel over 9 years a shared categorical framework in which the moral weight of what they were doing was dissolved. This is not the explanation for a single individual becoming capable of evil. This is the explanation for how an institution systematically produces evil from ordinary people, people who, removed from the institutional framework, would not have committed these acts individually. But the framework required an architect, and the architect was Shirō Ishii.
In 1959, Shirō Ishii died of throat cancer in Tokyo. He was 67 years old. He had spent the 14 years since Japan's surrender living quietly. He had never been charged. He had never been tried. He had given his data to the Americans, and they had kept their agreement. He died in his own bed, in Japan, attended by his family. There was no trial. There was no formal pronouncement of guilt.
There was the cancer, and the bed, and the family, and then the end. But the historical record exists, and the historical record functions, in the absence of a formal tribunal, as its own form of documentation.
Not catharsis in the way that a trial provides catharsis, the procedural legitimacy, the sentence, the formal closing of the institutional account, but documentation, the naming, the specific, sourced, verified account of what was done and who did it, and who chose not to prosecute. The American Immunity Agreement was not discovered by the public until the 1970s and 1980s, when journalists and researchers, most significantly the team at the Mainichi Shimbun newspaper and later American historian Sheldon Harris, began using declassified documents and Freedom of Information Act requests to reconstruct what had happened in 1945 and 1946. The scope of the cover-up, when it became clear, produced a specific form of historical reckoning that a formal trial would have foreclosed. Not just the indictment of one man, but the indictment of the institutional decision that had protected him. The United States government, in the immediate post-war years, had weighed the military value of Unit 731's data against the moral cost of granting immunity to its commander. They had made their calculation. The data had been filed. The immunity had been granted. The commander had gone home. And for 30 years, the families of the 3,000 to 10,000 people who had been processed as Marutas at Pingfang had no official acknowledgement that what had happened to their relatives was real, documented, and known to the governments of the world's major powers. The biological processes at the end of Shirō Ishii's life were, in clinical terms, unremarkable. Throat cancer, squamous cell carcinoma, the type associated with chronic irritation and cellular mutation over decades, progresses through stages of tissue invasion that are well documented in the medical literature. The same medical literature that Ishii had spent his career contributing to. The progression is not rapid. It is not painless. The throat is a structure through which breath passes, through which speech is produced, and its disease is experienced in the most immediate physical terms. The voice that diminishes, the airway that narrows, the act of breathing that becomes laborious. Whether Shirō Ishii, in the months before his death, understood the specific irony of the organ his cancer had chosen is not recorded anywhere. His death was not the justice that the institutional record demanded. He died as a free man, having negotiated his immunity with competence and apparent satisfaction,
having lived for 14 years in the country he had served, having provided the data that the Americans had wanted, and having received exactly the protection he had been promised.
The biological fact of his death is the only formal accounting the historical record contains, and it is not enough. It was not enough in 1959, and it is not enough now.
Here is what the historical record of Unit 731 actually teaches, in the sense of a lesson that can be extracted from the specific and applied universally. It teaches that the transformation from physician to commander of an atrocity program is not driven by individual pathology.
Ishii was not detected in his early career as someone with aberrant tendencies. His colleagues at Kyoto Imperial University did not recall him as disturbed or cruel. He was, by every available account from his early life, a competent, ambitious, well-trained scientist who made rational career decisions within the institutional framework available to him.
The transformation was driven by an institutional structure that identified a specific form of research as militarily valuable, removed the moral and legal constraints that would normally prevent that research from occurring, provided material resources and professional status to the individual willing to conduct it, and actively insulated that individual from accountability throughout the program's operational life.
Ishii did not create Unit 731 in isolation. He proposed a program to an institution that approved it. He received funding from an institution that allocated it. He conducted research that an institution classified and protected. And when the institution was defeated, a different institution, one with different national interests but identical pragmatic logic, decided to protect him further. The institutional production of atrocity does not require monsters at birth. It requires systems that create the conditions in which ordinary human capacities, ambition, institutional loyalty, professional pride, and the ability to perform cognitive categorization that creates moral distance are directed toward extraordinary harm.
These systems are not unique to Imperial Japan. They are not unique to the 1930s. They are not unique to military institutions.
Every institutional structure that asks its members to treat certain categories of people as less than fully human, that insulates the people conducting that treatment from accountability, and that provides professional incentives for escalating the treatment, is producing the conditions that Ishii required, the physician who sold insurance in Tokyo before the war, the military bureaucracy that approved his proposal, the army that funded his installation, the Americans who bought his data and protected his freedom, the 30 years of silence. Every element of this story is institutional. Every element of this story is recognizable. And none of the institutional mechanisms it describes have been retired from human use. The question that the record of Unit 731 leaves open is not what kind of person Shirō Ishii was. The record answers that question with sufficient documentation. The question it leaves open is this: what kind of institutions are currently providing the same permissions, the same incentives, the same categorical frameworks, and the same insulation from accountability to people who are, right now, ordinary? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this changed how you think about institutional accountability and the production of atrocity, hit the like button and subscribe for more history that refuses to simplify. We owe the people who were processed as Marutas at Pingfong at least that much honesty. Thanks for watching.